This is Season 4, Episode 11 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Sourcing to Table, or What Madness Have I Brought? Welcome to Mastering the RPG. Like I said, a tabletop RPG podcast all about maximizing your game, having a good time, advice, ideas, cool stuff found, all sorts of stuff like that. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and Chris. You can find all the information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. And you can send us email with feedback or questions at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. And that is, both of those are all one word, which is interesting because we do have an email tonight. So, hey guys, how are you doing? We're here after the holidays, so I hope your holidays went well. How did your holiday go there, Eric?
It went fine. Neither good or bad. I don't know. Not very exciting. I don't have a large family, so it's not like I don't have drama with holidays and anything like that. So yeah, it's fine. Not much gaming. I guess that's the only downside because everybody's busy.
That's true. Chris, how about you? How did your holidays go?
They went well. We went to California for my wife's family, and they are also not gamers. But it was good times with them. And then we hung out there for like a week. And apparently, there's some big fires in California that were happening as we left. We were unaware of.
Yeah.
And so I guess we missed all that.
Well, we know some folks who were in that area, so yeah, it's kind of scary for those folks. And
yeah,
for sure. Anybody who's listening, if you're there, we definitely, all the support and hope you're doing well and safe.
Yes.
My holidays, we had lots of family. We have a lot of kids and some grandkids now, and so we had a blast. We did a Secret Santa, and on my Secret Santa list of the 5 items I listed the Dungeon Master Guide for 2024 on my list, and somebody got it for me, but they got me the Player's Handbook. So they're not a gamer, so they didn't really know Player's Handbook versus Dungeon Master Guide. They didn't have an idea. So good on them for trying, though. That's the important thing. They tried to do something that was related to my hobby. So that was nice of them. So anyway, so we're back. It's great to see you guys again. And so we do have a great topic tonight, I think. It's very timely. I'll get into that when we get into it. But we do have an email, which is great. We love when people send us some email. And Eric's going to run this evening's festivities, so I'm actually going to turn the email over to him to talk about and tee it up.
Email.
Eric, take it away.
Yeah, so we got this awesome email from David B. So this person is writing about the metagaming and kind of on the usual other camp than it usually is. And I'm going to summarize it because it's a very long email. But basically that they're getting kind of frustrated with their new group that they're in, a D&D group, and with people online, that people are kind of so metagaming adverse that they often don't... especially in like a VTT environment, they don't use information they can see. Like if they can see the corner of an enemy, they're saying, "Oh, what my character might not see it, so I'm not gonna know that they're there." Things like that, where if you're too like hardcore about not metagaming, that you can kind of disregard information that you have to the point of But at the same, and they're making the point on the other side is that we're only playing this with tokens on a sheet. We're not in the person. So it's the whole thing with like game masters when they would be like, when you'd be searching a room, and the more like old school hardcore game masters would be like, well, you searched, but you didn't say you searched under the bed. And you're like, well, come on. Like I'm not there in person. If I was there and I did a search, I would be searching everywhere. Right. That's the kind of like thing. So there is like this hardcore, anti-metagaming, I would say, or anti like super realism, hyper realism. And that's what they're kind of bringing up a lot. Something like strategizing during fights, they're having problems with. And also things like making suboptimal choices, Like when like, it's the troll problem. And I brought this up. We've actually talked about this before, I think, in episodes here and in Tabletop Tango, where I call it the troll knowledge problem, where like we all know that trolls, right, have a generation and that you need fire acid, right? We all know that, but our characters might not know. So it's actually what I call is accidental metagaming, where you can't like help but metagame, right? There's always a level of metagaming. So they kind of bring that up about the trolls and them saying that, well, their character doesn't know, so I'm going to use fireball that I always use. And then, oh, okay, the troll's immune, whatever. This thing is immune to fire, right? The fire, whatever it is. Yeah, and so they pretty much they ask us whether they are right or totally right, and what they should say to their group. So yeah, very interesting points. Again, I think everybody has strong opinions about this. Carl, what are you thinking?
Well, so I've always been on the weird side of I don't really care that much if players metagame. I think it starts off. So they make a great point that the players are like the opposite. I haven't run into too many places where people have been so adverse to metagaming that they literally would stop, and they make the point that this person doesn't use fireball against a creature that has that vulnerability
immunity,
because they don't want to sound like they're metagaming, even though they use fireball all the time. So it's kind of like they're going a little bit over trying to not metagame, and I just have to wonder how strict are they? Do they always talk in character too? And do they? I'm very much more flexible, and I think metagaming it's just a natural part of the game because it's people playing the game. Like you said, we're just looking at a tabletop, and it's really hard not to metagame and not use your player knowledge versus character knowledge. And I don't get too bent out of shape about it, and I think you shouldn't get too bent out of shape if people really do want to be immersive and don't want to make choices that their character would not have made generally if it makes their fun, if that's what adds to their fun and immersion.
Chris?
Yeah, I think I have a couple interesting opinions on this. Is one, I think that the fact that you are going to know something is unavoidable. Is some derivation of you cannot separate the observer from the observed. I don't know what level this is, but at some level it's partially that. And I mostly don't think I care unless it ruins the experience for somebody other than you.
Yeah.
Like I have some examples where, like, I remember in a game there was a creature that was going to charm you, but one of the characters had this ability where if he sings this song, you couldn't be charmed. It was a bard. And he has never, ever played it in any room ever, but he plays it just before we enter this room because he must have read the hardcover book or something. So he knew that this was the time to do it, and then they bypassed that entire challenge because, randomly, according to him, he knew to do that. So that's the times that I think I don't like it, or when they I search for a secret door right here. I'm like, how did you know that that's where to search? Those things like that kind of ruin it a little bit. I care about, but mostly I think things are kind of a wash. Your character sees things that you necessarily wouldn't know that he saw, and then things the character wouldn't know. So I think they mostly balance out.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a hard line, and we really have to differentiate between those things of like reading the adventure and reading monster blocks as you're fighting them is different, right, than observing. And so I definitely have 2 points on these, and I agree with both of you guys. I think as Carl was saying, first of all, I think extremes are bad most of the time in most things, right? It's all about moderation, first of all. And I think metagaming did get a very dirty word, just as, gaming on rails or
railroading.
What? Yeah, sorry, railroading, right? Those are very the dirty words of gaming when they really shouldn't be as much. I mean, for me, we've actually had an episode in Tabletop Tango where we talked about metagaming and accidental metagaming and optimization. And that was me about talking about optimization versus metagaming, right? So I think metagaming is kind of split into two camps here too. We're talking about the in-character as we're playing metagaming, where we talked about having information from a map that we see, or just we have knowledge of something already as players and maybe not our characters. And then there's metagaming going all in on mechanics, which is totally fine, but when you do it to the character doesn't make any sense anymore, and you're taking 6 classes, and you're not paying the role playing stuff of how did you get these classes, right? And it's all different. But ultimately, it comes down to every group is different, and every group's going to have a different barometer on how much they want to, metagame, how much they want to optimize, everything like that, right? And some games and GMs and the player group that they're in like are totally cool with, making this more like a war game and just discussing strategies as they're doing combat because it's super hardcore combat. And some groups are going to be the opposite of that, are going to be like super role play, right? Where you don't have those things. So I think it's important, if maybe a group's not a fit for you, that's one thing, right? As Carl was saying, with this person saying, is he right? I don't think he has some good points. I don't think they're necessarily right in that those players aren't doing it wrong. Like, as long as they're not, like you said, Carl, they're not encroaching on you, or, they're encroaching on somebody else saying, well, you shouldn't do that because your character doesn't know, right? As long as they're not doing that, let them play how they're going to play. It might annoy you, but that's how they have fun, and you might have fun in a different way. So I think that was my only point. And then secondary, I think on the topic, which I definitely agree with a lot of points in here, is that when we do have these accidental role playing, that's what roles are for, right? The whole thing with like in Pathfinder 2e with recall knowledge is that like, and that's why I like how they framed it that way, because it's not like your character knows it or doesn't. It's like, can they recall it? So like the whole point of, okay, I can kind of see there's a token there in the VTT, but it's confusing if my character would actually see it. Then you ask the game master, hey, can I make a perception roll to see if I see that token that I might not be able to see? Leave it to the dice. That's what the dice are for, right? The dice are there to emulate all the realism side, all of the different factors you talked about of like smell and hearing and all that stuff. That's what the dice are for. If you see a creature that's vulnerable or immune to fire, right? And you're like, you as the player knows it, and you are a fire mage, right? Be like, I'm going to make a knowledge roll about this creature. Or, hey, GM, do I know that, like, trolls fire locks them down? Like, you do a roll as your character. Sometimes it really doesn't make sense for your character to know things. Other times, I think you should leave it to the dice. So I think ultimately that's the best way to operate as far as, like, trying to limit the kind of metagaming that we are just, we succumb to because we can't help it, right? So I think
and
the
you've got
dice
that
is
option
the arbiter.
The more modern games, like you're saying, with perception checks and arcana checks and stuff like that. Old school D&D, you didn't really have that, so lots of times, I'll do an int check to see if I do know something, but there really wasn't perception or so. I think that's kind of where maybe back in the day, player knowledge was much more encroached a lot more in, because sometimes it had to. There wasn't that option, but now in modern games you have that option. So
and a lot of modern games, like I think we brought this up beforehand, like the whole like Pathfinder 2e has a thing where when you're searching for traps, you're just searching for traps in the
Right. Yep.
In the whole dungeon, right? You don't have to say every single room where you're searching for traps. You don't have to say, oh, I was looking in the door frame specifically. The GM's like, oh, you were only looking on the ground. You didn't look above you. You're like, well, I was looking for traps, right? That's too extreme. I think I see your pain in this. I just, as long as they're not encroaching on you, like, who cares what they do or not, right? It might not just be the right group for you. That's there's going to be different groups that have different how they like to play. So that's my final thought on that.
All right. So everything in moderation, and how you like to play the game is how you like to play the game, right? So
yeah, and I think we should all forgive ourselves for we're just going to know things about. We're going to metagame. Like, we just have to accept it. It's going to happen. Even if you don't want it to, it's going to happen. So
and that's why
you have to accept that.
There's no way to force it. In our game, you guys talk a lot about battle strategy, and you're helping people understand their skills. And I allow it because, this player character would know how to use their magic optimally, because that's their job. So why Eric talking to them about how to use it optimally? Why would that get me bent out of shape? Because that character would know that without prompting.
Yeah, and I'm not doing it to be like, here's the most optimal strategy. I've been doing it because they don't know the rules as well as me, and I'm like, hey, if you forgot, there's universal modifiers you can apply.
Right. And your character
wouldn't
wouldn't
do
have
it. Just
that.
There's other options for you. Yeah.
So, okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much for that email. We really do appreciate it, David. Sorry we didn't really read the whole thing, but I think all the text gave us a lot of background and understanding so that we could be more informed in our opinions. So if you're sending an email, we don't mind if they're long. Don't worry about it. So again, thanks, David. And so moving on, so we have a really cool main topic, which is very timely for a campaign I'm about to run. And Eric's going to be our moderator for this evening, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Eric once again to talk through the main topic.
All right. Yeah. So the main topic today is all about sourcing the table. And this is something that we have talked about so many times in so many different episodes. You know, we talk about session zeros a lot and the importance of session zeros. And we talk a lot about, as a hint, sourcing the table. And so what do we mean by that is sourcing the table is when basically you are spacing out. When you are,
when you're asking the table for help with
you're tapping the players.
Tapping them on
there was
the
a word
shoulders.
I was looking for, but yeah, you're tapping the players to help fill out the world building for you, right? And this is beyond just doing their own backstories. This is like creating lore, names, places, significant events that have shaped the world. This could be certain factions. This could be religions. This could be all different types of stuff. Generally, this is started at session 0 or session, I think you were saying like -1 or, the session 0 is this, and then you have another session 0.5. It's generally done before session 0 or at session 0. And yeah, it really just expands upon the world, and you're using players to help you with this as a game master. So I think, Carl, why this is timely because, yeah.
Well, it's key because this is world building, helping with world building. It is not... like you said, backstories. Backstories is a whole different thing. That's just as important that the players bring to the table to help drive lore and storytelling. But it's really tapping the shoulders to get world building, help them build out this place, versus it all coming from the GM's brain. And so it's very timely for me because we're about to start a campaign. A science fiction campaign where I've decided I'm going to do a lot of sourcing the table. I'm coming with almost nothing to the table. I've asked you guys, what do you want to do? What kind of adventure is this going to be? What kind of factions are there? And when we get together, I'm even going to ask you what you call stuff and who's the guy who runs the place and all those things, because I think those will help me be a little more excited about kind of weaving those things in, which leads to our next one. But Chris,
why do you source the table? I think we talked about this. It saves you time as a game master, right? You don't have to do as much work for pre-planning the campaign. Another one is definitely player engagement. Players are just naturally going to be more engaged for things they come up with. And I would say sourcing the table is something that I did in my own campaign, and we'll go obviously get into the more details of everything and all our tips and hints. But I also, as a player, I'm very, very on board for providing lore. That's one of the things I love doing, and I've often done in a lot of games. So, so I speak from experience on both sides on this, so player engagement. I think finally, it helps,
So,
somebody there.
I think one of the things that I don't know if you hit on yet, but and I mentioned it. It really expands beyond just my personal ideas or my. There's like 5 players and they all have different brains and different ways of thinking about things, and I just would not even have maybe gone down that rabbit hole of a certain thing, because again, a lot of the folks you're modified, or I don't know, modified is not the right word. You're informed by the media, you're informed by people and by how things you've done and other campaigns you might have been in, all stuff that I would not necessarily have been involved with at all. And so therefore none of those things would have occurred to me. And so the players can bring that interesting, and you do this all the time. You talk about, like when we were doing the current one, you guys are coming up with a faction, and you're going, well, it feels like this, and remember that game that does this, and we had this thing, and then Mass Effect did that, and you guys are just playing off of that, coming up with ideas based on things that I've never played Mass Effect, so I would never even come to me. Right,
books. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So it seems fresh across the board. Chris, what are some other reasons that you would source the table?
Sorry, I lost connection for a second, so I hope I didn't miss this point. But I like to do it to make sure the players are seeing the things that they want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe I haven't included it, so the new city that I really don't care much about. When they arrive there, you're like, "Well, you tell me what the city looks like when you walk in," and then I know that they are visiting a place that they maybe have wanted to or dreaded or something. But really, just to put that in so that at least parts of this world are exactly the things that they've wanted to encounter.
Definitely, yeah. That definitely expands upon the engagement. Is that like they're gonna get stuff out of it that's like a lock, right? And one thing as a game master is like you can spend so much time writing the history of X church and this tavern and be like, oh, it's so cool, and the players just burn it down or something and don't care about it. But if they can describe a tavern, it's going to be like the best thing ever. So, but yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why you want to source the table, and I think, and those are big reasons, right? Like saving time is huge. Expanding your the world behind beyond your own kind of experience is huge. So, what are some of the main hurdles though, and the problems, like things to watch for in this? Chris, have you kind of encountered any kind of big hurdles when it comes to sourcing the table?
Yeah, if something is very specific that needs to be very specific to meet some plot point or whatever, and you try to hand part of that off, and it sort of no longer works anymore because you did, that has happened to me. Sort of maybe this is a side point, but since I make adventures that I sell, sometimes I have to wonder how much I'm getting from others that I now don't fully have the right to use anymore. So understanding where that line is, like in being inspired versus directly taking from, and that kind of thing. So both of those things are things that I hesitate with.
What about you, Carl?
Well, I think you're kind of hitting it on the head. One of the big ones is you've got to be prepared for what the players tell you may not fit. I think this is what Chris was getting. It may not fit what you were thinking. So if you're coming to the table and you're saying, well, here's how things are going to work, and you open your mouth and say, what's a major faction, and the major faction turns into Death Knights who are backed by a lich, and you're going, well, that's completely off the rails. Well, you kind of opened the door for that. So that's one of the hurdles, is that the lore just doesn't fit what you had in mind. And then the players, they just created that. They're going to be possessive, and they're going to want to see that now because they just came up with this awesome idea, and they're not going to want you to kill their baby anymore now that they've come up with something cool. And it's cool. That's absolutely cool. But you're like, holy smokes, how do I fit that in now? I shouldn't open my mouth.
Yeah, the possessive one's a big thing. And I think that's part of like being, and we'll talk about it in the hints more, but like being kind of open and being communicative as a game master when you're talking about sourcing the table, because some players might really, really, really not want you to mess with it, and they have maybe too much lore, maybe even lore they haven't written down, and you're like, well, this is what's happening, and they're like, well, that's not what would happen. And you're kind of like, well, I already kind of made this adventure needs to happen this way, and this is what's happening. You know what I mean? So that's definitely something to be aware of, and that's more of like player, knowledge about your players. That some might just have a much more, affinity and be more possessive about it. Also, I think another problem is that some players might feel like a secondary character if the game master kind of latches on and uses too much of another player's lore or backstory, right? This could be in a backstory. And this is not just in sourcing the table. This could be if one player writes a more detailed backstory than everybody else, and that, really, really uses that for like most of the game, and that's what it's drawing from mostly, then some player, and again, you have to know your group. This is not always the case, but that can be a problem, right? Where then those other people are going to feel like they're not the main character, right? They're not main characters. They're kind of secondary characters to the main character. So that's another thing to look out for. Carl, I think you have a point.
Well, I was just going to say, it's beyond just even secondary characters. You just may disagree with each other, and the direction things are going. Like the campaign we're sourcing now. You guys are coming up with a faction. Two of the players are coming up with a faction, and then the other players may be coming up with the other factions. But if we all had to do the same thing and define something, they may just not disagree. They may say, your cybernetic just doesn't work for them, and they don't want to have that as a faction. But fortunately, I don't think that's going to be the problem, because that's just one of many. But it could come up, right? Somebody could push back and say,
totally,
I just don't like that idea, and now you got conflict. and nobody's happy.
Player conflict.
Yeah, player conflict.
Because, it's always easier as the game master, you're in a position of authority, within the context. And so it's always easier to hear things from a game master than it is from another player. That even goes back to the email that we just talked about, right? It's much, if another player is kind of admonishing you for metagaming, it's going to come a lot differently than a game master doing it, right? Because it's the game master's world. They're the ones running it. So it's like, you're okay, whatever you say ultimately goes. So that's the same thing with lore too.
It's my world. You just play in it.
Well, not totally, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just always easier to have stuff come from a game master. And we've even talked about that. If you have a problem with another player, how they've been playing, or if you think they've been cheating, it's always good to generally probably talk to the game master first over talking to the other player directly. I think another hurdle is that, unless somebody else wants to bring this up, that sometimes, I don't know who wrote that. I think that was you, Carl. But source material that's too detailed can leave less for building adventures. I think that's you, Carl. Why don't you expand upon that?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, it goes. It's like backstories, right? If people get really invested in their lore and they start writing copious amounts of information on the details of the society and how things work, and there's this person who's against this person, and then there was the Great War of 1923, and blah 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 blah. There's
okay, I know what you mean now.
You lose. There's no space. All the oxygen's been sucked out of the air. How do I build an adventure when every detail of this particular thing has already been defined to the nth degree, and the player's already created the story, just like a heavy backstory might do. You've already created the story, and there's not a lot of room to play in, and that's an issue with lots of published settings. Not some published settings, like that was a problem with Dragonlance, for example. It was so rich and so many stories, there wasn't a lot of space for maybe some new adventures, and that's not really sourcing the table, but it's kind of an example of where things kind of suck the air out of the room for building your adventures on top of what the players came up with.
For sure, yeah. You definitely want to, and I think that leads right into this next subject, next topic, or next part is that let's talk about laying the groundwork, which is like GM prep. And I think right to your point, Carl, I just want to bring it up, is that to kind of combat that, it's really, really important as a game master to set your constraints. Know the scope of what you want from the players, their lore, and really set the constraints of, okay, you guys can work on this parts, or you guys can work on this part of the world, or you guys can, like in Carl, you're being very open in this game, that we're having a lot more control over what lore we can write. But still, I think generally it's good to set some type of constraints of, okay, keep it under this amount, or let's not get too detailed, right? So that's important for a game master to do, is to really know how much you want from the players and then communicate that effectively, right? So you don't have into those problems, those hurdles we talked about. Chris, what are some other ways that you kind of prep for sourcing the table?
One tied into backstories a lot, so I kind of know a little bit from that how they, like, what their character arc or character journey is, so I can kind of know when those moments are that this person is going to be the best to add on to the story right here, because it sort of pertains to something. And then again with the time saver thing, I prep because there's areas that I know don't have any big impact on anything, and those are the times that I set it up that somebody else can sort of hold the paintbrush for a while.
Yeah, that is huge, and that is something that, so in my game, which I did source the table, but one of the things that I do is I wrote all the main lore down ahead of time. And this also goes to something that I also do, is that I'll create a shared document, like a Google Doc, but you can use there's so many other programs, right? I forget even what they're called, maybe you guys know, but there's all these group world building lore programs you can use, but I just use Google Docs. And I think it's really important to create a very concise outline, right? Like have your, main lore, have your faction area, and then have really distinct, here are the main players, that's what I call it, or the main factions, whatever. Here's the minor ones. And so you're very clear about where everything is, and it stays organized. And then on top of that, what you were saying, Chris, I think, is that, really, really, really lock down your main areas, the things that you are this is what's, I have locked down. This is what the main kind of stuff's about, and then here are the spaces where the players can then play, right? Here's where you can. And now often this is, again, it's going to always vary between game and game. Like in Carl's game right now, we're having a much bigger impact than probably most games, right? In my game, it was like, well, you guys are all coming to this place. This basically the Bahamas. It's kind of like these Bermuda Triangle Bahamas, but you guys can create, kind of the countries where you're from that have led to this place. Because my game is all taking place in these the Bahamas area, basically. So I was like, you guys can have free reign to kind of, outside of the main factions, you guys can create your own countries. Here's a map. Feel free to grab something, create a country, create a religion that's in it. Like, I'll work with that, right? So, yeah, I think it's really, really important as a game master to lock down your main lore and then have your sacred spaces where they're not going to be touched by the players. And then here's where you can write lore. Carl, what are some of the other ways that you prep?
Well, I was going to say, and to align with, kind of coming to the point of setting constraints and, understanding where your sacred spaces are. Really do develop and sit down, and this is for this session 0 kind of thing, not if they come into town and you want to ask them what's the main religion in this town or something along those lines and give them some free reign there. This is really in the session 0. Develop the questions you want the players to help answer. I mean, know what you're asking for. And like the game we're doing now, I opened it up a lot because I'm asking you guys. It's like you guys can get to define the 3 major world or factions or empires that exist and kind of why they exist. You guys, but that's because I was willing to ask that question. If you really just want to say, hey, I need some names, I need some major people, I need some this, then write down what you're going to ask, and then that becomes the constraints of which the players can work through, and they know then that they're not. They know the lines that they shouldn't be scribbling outside of. And that's kind of what you did with your main lore. It's like, hey, these factions are important, and you shouldn't touch them. But all your country is fair game. Do whatever you want, and so that's perfectly fine.
I think that's a really good point about preparing your questions ahead of time. Again, but most of us, like, we can, when you go, it's like the common thing with you go to the doctor's appointment and then afterwards you're like, why didn't I ask this question? Why didn't I totally forgot to ask these questions, right? So it's like you might beforehand know what you're going into, but when you're actually in session 0 and you're explaining things to players and, you're getting excited and they're asking other questions, you might forget. Right. So I think it is good to maybe jot down some like your main kind of notes that you want to touch on for sure. And that's, I think, general session 0, but especially when it comes to the lore stuff. Cool. Do we have any other people want to talk about kind of laying the groundwork, or can we move on to the next section? All right. That is the silence I will take as this. So we will move on.
Crickets.
Let's actually talk now. What?
I said crickets.
Yeah. Crickets. So let's actually talk about, the session 0 tips themselves and getting players engaged. So we're in session 0. How do we get them engaged? What are some of the ways, Carl, that you kind of get players engaged in session 0, especially with sourcing the table?
Well, well, first off is you gotta know your players a little bit. In our game, there's some players who are going to. Like yourself, who are going to help push the train. So I'm letting you help get behind the train a little bit and push while I pull, because I know that you'll get your energy will get others excited for that. And so kind of understanding clearly what you're looking for from the players, and that they understand, and then have an ally, in that session who's interested in doing it now. Because if your players aren't really and they just come and it's crickets while you're talking, then maybe this isn't the right approach. But if there's somebody there who is a player who can kind of help get the fire stoked a little bit and say, well, okay, let me tell you what I was thinking, and then everybody else starts. It's like in the brainstorming, somebody's got to start the spigot going and opening the floodgates. It's not just sit down, ask the question. With a blank sheet of paper and have everybody just suddenly their creative juices start flowing. You might need to prime the pump a little bit.
Totally. It's like the the group of friends and the one person goes up to dance at the dance and then you're like, okay, everybody else then joins, right? Lead by example. It is really good. It's so important to have a player that's engaged if you want to do this. Like that's almost essential that you have at least one person who's like gung ho about it. Like in my game, it was most of the people weren't too like on top of wanting to necessarily do lore, and I had one of the guys in who was just totally down, just like I am, and like did his stuff and was like helping the other people and organize, and so that was like so helpful to me. So that's big. And I think on your point, Carl, you need to know the players. You want to know who's more naturally inclined than others. To your point though about getting them more engaged, I think one of the ways you can do as a tip is kind of gamify it almost. Basically offer rewards to players. I've seen other people be like, what I mean by rewards is like extra starting money for a character, special gear, special connections, right? Have some type of tangible reward. And don't make them like, okay, you have to write like an essay. It can be like just a paragraph, right, on a certain faction. But just kind of, like you said, getting those juices flowing, it's kind of like once you take that first step and you get kind of maybe past, if a player maybe has, is kind of insecure about doing this or has never done it before or whatever the reasons, if you offer a reward, like, okay, if everybody, if you write like about one little country or one religion or something, then you'll start with like a special item that grows with you or whatever it is, right? That's a good way to kind of like get people over that hump of like starting. Right? It's always hardest to start. Chris, do you have any kind of tips here for getting people engaged in Session Zero?
Sometimes people have those surveys that they take before a game, like what do you hope to see in this game? What kind of creatures do you hope to encounter?
Yeah.
So any of those that don't get fulfilled by the natural story, like the plot, the main thing that the GM has designed, I think those can be revisited for also these times. Like, this is a way that they can be prepared ahead of time because they filled out that survey, and now you can remind them at this time, like, hey, can you help describe this place or faction or whatever? And they have their survey list still there, the things that they haven't encountered yet, and sort of maybe that will help prompt them, in a way to create something right then.
Definitely. Carl?
So we, I'm looking at the outline, and one of the things that we were talking a little bit about off the mic there is how much time do we give folks or give what. So to engage those players, I'm going to turn it back to you, Eric. What are your...
I think minimally you should do 2 weeks. I mean, it depends how much you're sourcing the table, right? But I think generally you want to be almost doing this before you do character creation, because often people are going to want to do, I mean, not always, people kind of come up with characters they want to do, and it can, that's like with me. Like I kind of had ideas for a character, and Sean, another player of ours, was coming up with ideas for a character, and that kind of led me to having cybernetics, and that me and Sean then talked about it, and I called Sean, and we made this whole civilization that was about like cybernetics and digital consciousness and stuff like that. So it kind of happened organically, but generally, people are going to want to create characters after they know the lore, right? They want to create a character that's kind of built around the lore, and you want them to create characters that are built around the lore. So I think it's important to not do this like just do everything, especially if they're not experienced like our group, Carl. Like what I kind of meant is like doing, all the lore stuff and having to write it. Also have to do your character creation, and then you only have a week until the game starts, right? That's what I meant is like 2 weeks at least, just to give some breathing room as far as creating lore and then creating characters.
And that's why I call it session -1. But that's true. So there's, I think where I thought you were going from was kind of like, hey, you get to create some lore, go do it. And then 2 weeks later, out pops some lore that you're going to take advantage of. And I'm much more interested now. You guys are doing that. You're taking some time to do offline creation, talking to each other, and that's super great. But I think there's also a place for, when you're around the table, having that natural, all 5 people are engaged and they're talking and they're going. And I think it's going to be really cool, the game I'm doing now, because you guys have come up with a faction and built some lore out around it, that people can look at that as a template and say, oh, okay, so this is what this faction looks like. Now, when I ask you to do the other ones, they can start going, oh, well,
totally.
How does this work in? So somebody's done some pre-work, but we still can do something very organic at the table, the kind of right away before character creation, right? We do need to have that stuff put together before we go ahead and create characters, unless it's, there's games that are all about storytelling and character creation's kind of minimal part of it. But for the
Definitely,
normal
yeah.
games that we're talking about, then yeah, you do need some time to digest that lore you've created and internalize it.
And to that point, I just want to touch on and I talked about before about like creating that outline is really important. Like something I did, if you saw in that document, Carl, is that like the way I built my the faction out, right? I have like a government and this is something to help with factions, I think. And you don't have to do it as intense as I did it, but have some type of little outline of how you want it structured. I think that helps people the most. So I have something like the government, the faction name, and then I have like a little thing that's like government type, right? And then like history and where they are now, like present day, like have that like as like bullet points, and then areas of interest or like the way they military, like how they treat their military, things like that. Like have those little points, so when a player does want to create a faction, they can just use that as a kind of the outline, and they don't have to think about like, well, how do I even approach this, right? You've already kind of created like, okay, just do like a couple sentences about their history, do a couple sentences about how you think their military is, or what they care about, like if they care about lumber or gold or magic, whatever it is, right? So that's another way to help. Chris, do you have any tips here?
Well, I have part of a draft of a book on factions that I was going to create that you just described.
Oh,
a huge part of it.
Okay.
Like it's going to have like a little form that you can fill out to like, this is the name, this is the type of government or type of hierarchy it has, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so anyway, that was very interesting to listen to that because that is literally like a part of it.
That's funny. Well, so you agree, yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with all of that, essentially. But yeah, if you can like sort of show the format or an example or like lead the way or hold their hand until enough momentum has been achieved that you can let go of them, like, okay, good, now you're doing it, just keep going.
And Eric's done this for his faction, and I think it's important to say it's only like 3/4 of a page. It's it's not it may sound like it was like a significant amount of prose for all these different questions, but it's not. I mean, it's really 3/4 of a page of text that describes this.
I will say to that, Carl, though, like that is, I could have written a lot more, totally. But I knew that, and this is something for because I'm a game master and I've done this, like I knew that I should not be too detailed, and I don't want to overwhelm you, and I didn't want to especially overwhelm some of the other players who are not necessarily going to read too much. So that's something as a game master, again, to like manage those expectations, right? You don't want to have them writing a 2-page thing about the faction because nobody's going to read that and retain that, right?
Well, and
it doesn't leave you room to play around with it.
Yeah, one of the main hurdles was sort material too detailed, right? And
exactly,
too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think another hint here too is definitely you have to be the moderator when it comes to the session 0 and you're all discussing. Let them talk between each other, but no one to step in, kind of. And if you see somebody being really quiet, be like, hey. Like, I'm just saying Jeremy, right? Jeremy's really quiet. Hey, Jeremy, like, what do you think? Like, do you have any factions you want to do? Or, you mentioned something to me before about this, like, expand upon that. So you might have to, like, like you're a leader of a group, which you are, right? Just kind of moderate everything and make sure that the quieter players are also getting their say, right? For somebody like me who might talk a lot and be very excited and maybe, anyways.
Well, that's the classic spotlight. Make sure you throw the spotlight across the table. Classic thing.
And that happens in the sourcing the table too, right? Because there's going to be players who are more into it. So, Carl, I think you still have another. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, as you're moving across the table and you're getting multiple people involved, I think these are all very good yes and type of conversations.
Definitely.
Not just like rejecting something, but building on it and kind of folding it in.
Or twisting it, or like, okay, I like where you're going with this part. This part doesn't really work, but like, let's expand more upon that. I really like, definitely doing the yes and keeping it positive, like encouragement, 100%, Chris. That's a really good point. I think, Carl, you had another probably hint here too,
Well, the
right?
final thing I'll say is so we've gone through this process. Make sure you restate the decisions or the thoughts that everybody's agreed to, and then have somebody capture it. So, Eric, I'll ask you to capture it when we go through that.
Maybe not. I have ADHD. It's hard for me to do it.
Maybe we'll get someone else.
We'll
we got
see.
another person who likes to take notes. We'll have them take the notes.
Yeah.
But I think that's important so that everybody, when it gets done, they say, well, wait, I thought that that faction magic. Well, no, we decided that magic wasn't their key thing. It was this. Oh, okay. So making sure that
Definitely.
you restate things. It's almost like a meeting, right? Like it's a meeting where you
It
had the
is.
agenda and you restated the outcome, and we've captured those meeting minutes so that we can then use them going forward.
I mean, it's basically part of it's game development. I mean, it's definitely not as strict and as intense, but it is game development. You are collaboration. I'm just gonna say collaboration wise, coming up with story for the game you're about to run. So, and with a knowledge of mechanics and how they're going to interact with it. So definitely, that's a good point, Carl. Let's move on. Unless anybody else has another point here. Let's talk about actually utilizing the player content in game. I think one thing to do here, I'll just start, is it's really good to expand upon player lore. What I mean by that is, again, and some players might have they just don't want their touched at all, but if they're not doing it so detailed, you can expand upon player lore with secrets that they might not know. Hidden factions, a dark history, things like that. Like in my game that I'm running, and I don't want to talk specifically because I want my players do listen to this podcast. But I have people who created a faction, and I'm like, that gave me a really good idea for they're not going to know about this, but there's this like hidden thing that's going on with their people. So, definitely expand upon it in that way, where like you can find the kind of edges where they haven't talked about and expand there and make so you're surprising them, and that will get them excited most of the time. And I think Carl, you might have a tie into this.
Well, I just wanted the one of the things that may be obvious, but it does use the information. Right, so if you're going to go to the trouble of having players create factions, and then those factions have nothing to do with anything because, that wasn't exactly what I wanted. I thought they'd do something different, and so, or just use it. I mean, take advantage of it, and be very careful not to step all over these carefully crafted ideas that the players have come up with. They're passionate when they offered this up. Don't just dismiss it out of hand or dump it in the garbage. Don't use it or twist it so that it's completely different than what they thought they had talked about, because they spent the energy, mental energy, emotional energy, investing in giving you ideas. So that's one thing that I would say is important.
Yeah, it's what I was talking about before is not saying changing the core of it. I think
wasn't saying
that was
you
clear,
were.
right,
No.
Carl? No,
Yeah.
I don't think you were, but but you, I don't know if you agree with what I was saying about finding those places where you can maybe add stuff or things that the player characters or even the players might not know about, right?
I mean, there's holes in their narrative that you can fill that
Okay,
do not
yeah.
that do not that do not stray from
Impede
the player's
their,
ideals.
their stuff.
It enhances
Yeah.
what they have versus crush
All
their
right.
dreams.
So you
right?
agree? Cool.
Yeah.
Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
I think another way to help utilize these things or to really weave them in, right, is to revisit stuff you've already gone over. Because if you just discovered that the big Death Knight faction, Knights of Rust, exists, and you have visited some other places, like, well, have they ever been in that territory now? Maybe you should revisit that and see if there's, evidence of them or things that they've done, or there's a new country just your player just came up with. Has that now tied into some other things you've planned before, and sort of just kind of make sure that you've rooted it in all the places that it really would have affected.
Yeah, for sure. I think another one here is, I think, Carl, you touched upon this, but try and utilize, like you said, don't just throw it away, but try to utilize at least from every player something. And it is going to vary, right? Some players are going to make, they're just going to maybe be better at it, more experienced at it. They wrote more about it, so there's just going to be richer stuff to draw from. Another player might have just barely written anything. So don't expect to have the same level of, of tie-in for both of them, but still try to have something, at least at some point, for that player, something they did. I think that's what you were saying too, Carl, basically, right? It doesn't have to be equal, for sure, but definitely have at least something so all the players feel like their contributions meant something, right?
Yeah, I think so,
yeah.
for sure. And one last thing I would like to also mention is, and this may be controversial, you guys may disagree with this, and that's perfectly fine, but unless it's really special circumstances, I think the source material personally should be knowledge that the player character has, because they created it, and so it's tough for me to, you created a cool faction with some cool information about it, and then it's like, oh no, that's all secret. Your character would not know any of this. But wait a second, I kind of invented some of this. But then that's where you don't let them go too deep into all the dark, deep secrets. You need to own some of that so that they don't have that knowledge. But if they're saying that, their civilization is all about cybernetics, that shouldn't be a secret, right? That's player knowledge, character knowledge that they would know. So I don't know if that's controversial or not, but I'd hate I hate the idea of having that information and like that. So.
I do disagree with you, Carl, but not completely. I agree and disagree with you. I think where I disagree with you is that I've been in games, and personally, when I've been a player, where we've created a lot of lore of a big world, and some of this is like across, my characters from X, like before we even made characters, we created lore here, we created lore in this country, we created in this country. So my characters from this country, Eric, I created lore there, but I also created lore way over there. And my character's just not going to know. He hasn't traveled there ever before. So he's not going to know about this country. Might not even know if it has ever existed, right? So I think it depends on context, I think is my point. I don't think that's what the point you were making.
I think that's fair. I guess I was specifically, like, if you had a player from,
if they created a character from the faction that they created...
Yeah, they should know that information. But obviously, if you're sitting at the table when somebody else said something and you wouldn't know it, well, then that's a different thing altogether. So I think we're on the same page. It's just we're coming from
we're on the same page. I just wanted to touch on that. Like, it depends on the scope, is right, because if you're really sourcing them to make a lot of different factions, and then when it comes down to it, they make a character that wouldn't be. And this actually goes to the email, right? We're getting into again about player knowledge versus character knowledge, which is such a we even did an episode about that. And that's another one where you might be like, well, my character doesn't know about this. Even though I created the lore, my character just doesn't know about it. But then when the GM's like, hey, like, what is the deal with, like, their religion there? Like, you can still, as a player, be like, oh, this is what I meant by this. This is generally what the deal is. And then you switch, your brain and go back to your character who doesn't know, right? So it can be tricky. I think that's another thing to maybe look out for as a game master, is that if you're having them source a lot of stuff, there is going to be that kind of switching between player character knowledge and character knowledge, player character knowledge and player knowledge for sure. So that's something to kind of balance as well. Chris, do you have any other kind of tips here?
I don't.
Okay. I think we talked about a little bit, but I think
he just didn't want to call me out. That's easily.
Well, I did have a disagreement, but Eric already corrected my exact disagreement, so there's really no point.
Oh, okay, the same kind of thing. You're like, because okay, all right. Well, there you go. Carl, do you have any other thoughts?
Let's see if I can think anything else that I would throw in there, but. No, I think those are some of the big ones. There obviously could be some other things. You want to make sure you're tying in all this content to the actual adventures, but we talked about that. Leveraging that
quests,
information.
For sure. I think one thing to do is also have lore overlap. That can be really fun and different for people. What I mean by that is have, maybe in the background, maybe not, but have the different lore that characters have made, like different characters, have those like overlap or ask them. And that's another thing you can do while you're playing the game. Don't be afraid to still source the table, right? As you're going, you can say from like, maybe not during game time, but like outside of game time, be like, hey, like, this part, like, what are your thoughts on this? Or do you have any ideas about this? Or can somebody still help me? Like, can you, make a tavern? Like, don't be afraid to still source the table is my point, I guess. And that'll keep this engagement going. It'll keep the kind of juices flowing. It'll keep the, all the benefits that we said, that'll keep going. So this is not just a session 0 thing, is my point.
No,
it's something that you can kind of continually do, for sure.
I think a lot of people, when they talk about sourcing the table, they're talking specifically not about session 0. It really is things like,
interesting. Yeah,
you've come into this town, help flesh out this town that you've never I haven't defined it as a game master, and I'm interested to see what you guys might think is there. So it's definitely it's a tool to be used throughout the play. I think of it more of a session 0 thing as world building, but there's micro world building too. Maybe it's not as interesting if you say, tell me what the tavern serves, that's their best dish. Kind of just, it's I don't know, that's that's not really interesting, but telling them something about the tavern that sticks out to the player when they enter, that draws their interest, might be something that you'd want to have. So, yeah.
I like this. It keeps them on their toes. It keeps their attention on the game, too, sometimes when they're just listening to your narrative.
Yeah.
I have another tip, too, I just wanted to say, too. This is, I think, a learned skill, right? So you might not be super good at handing off the mic while you're doing your game. So if anybody isn't ready to do this on their main thing, but you have a one-shot or something that you specifically want to run to practice this before you introduce it in something that matters, that is another way to like kind of get good at it. Just Friday we're going to run something different, and you don't even have to tell them or whatever, but mark the points that you're going to specifically ask people to help, and then practice it that way. And then when you're feeling it more, you can then work it into something bigger that you're doing.
That's a really good point, Chris. And I think that's another way to utilize the content is like and we've talked about this before, sometimes to do side quests or to do like, mid campaign to kind of do like a side adventure with different characters. And that can be also, it's all in your world, but that can be then a way to explore the player, those lores, and it's not a big of a deal as if the player kind of takes more control because that's their lore, right? Because you're not, it's not the main campaign, and then you can actually flesh out that stuff because you're playing in that space more. So that is another way. That's a good point, Chris. Is that you can definitely have some one shots, have some like mini campaigns that take place in these player areas, however they are, to kind of expand upon them. Cool. So do we have any final thoughts, gentlemen? Carl? Any final thoughts here?
For my final thoughts, it's if you haven't thought about doing this, go ahead and I think Chris mentioned maybe a one shot, but definitely take advantage of it. You may my entire gaming career has been mostly homebrew. I don't play in a lot of settings other than Dragonlance. I like Dragonlance, but I don't play in other people's sandboxes a lot. And so, it's nice to just kind of break it in this adventure or this campaign we're doing now. Just break and say, let me hear what you guys are thinking. I can have a meta narrative that an overarching plan that leverages all these folks, but all these things that their people are coming up with. But help me come up with it, because I would not have thought of the faction that you guys have already thought of. I just would not have. That would not have been something I would have come up with. So just try it. Give the players a chance to surprise you with their cool ideas that you can then weave into an adventure that they're going to be even more engaged in because they helped create the backstory.
Yeah, awesome. Chris?
I agree with what Carl just said.
All right. Okay. And for me, on top of that, Carl, I think, I totally agree with you. I think, while we brought up hurdles, I think honestly, they're pretty minimal as long as you're kind of aware and conscious of those things, then it's very minimal. It's mostly upsides, honestly. And if you are new to it, just start small. I think that was another point that we were kind of making, right? And that's what you were saying, Carl, is that just start it small, like Chris was saying. This is a learned skill, and you don't have to let them take the reins over everything. Have them make just some small areas, right, to fill out, and that's good for the players. It's good for the game masters, and you'll see. Ultimately, it'll just save you time. It'll expand the richness of the lore, and it will increase player engagement, which is all good things. So I think this is just one of those skills that a lot of game masters might not even, when new game masters don't even really think about, but once you get used to doing this, it's such a powerful ability. It's such a powerful aspect of creating your own worlds is this, and very important. So yeah.
Very cool. All right. Hey, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com to learn more about the projects and us and the things we're working on. You can contact us at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com if you've got a question, need some advice, have some differences of opinion, which we just had to talk about and give our 2 cents on. So we really enjoy getting email. We really do. So please do so. If you like the show, help us with positive reviews, get your friends to watch, share on social media, all that good stuff that helps podcast grow, and we would appreciate that. So once again, this is Carl with Eric and Chris. Say goodbye, guys.
Happy gaming.
Yeah, have a good games.